The Jerry Pal podcast is brought to you by Archstone Foundation, preparing society and meeting the needs of an aging population. And now, here are your hosts.
Welcome to the Jerry Pal podcast. This is Eric Guidera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, it's been a while since I saw you.
It's been a while. I got a haircut.
Oh, nice.
COVID haircut. Couldn't take it anymore. Shaved it all off.
Wait, I see somebody else on our Zoom call.
Yes, we are fortunate and honored to be to have a return guest, Louise Aronson, who is with us today, who's a professor of medicine at UCSF in the Division of Geriatrics. She's the author of the book Elderhood, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. We did a podcast with her about that book. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. She's been writing furiously in the midst of this COVID epidemic about ageism, with articles in the New England Journal, Times, Vox, Atlantic, Forbes, and other outlets soon to come. Welcome back to the Jerry Pal podcast, Louise. I
am honored to be on twice. That's pretty, I feel like that's some kind of stature I have to figure out what to do with. I was going to say frequent flyer miles, but those are not so useful lately.
We'll give you a branded Jerry Pal face mask. How about that?
Oh, that would be awesome.
We need those. That's actually not a bad idea. Yeah.
I would wear that. I'm going into all these senior facilities. I would totally wear that. And they would say, what is on your face?
What is that? I know we had Jerry Pal t-shirts at one point. This is a non sequitur. We'll get to the song. But I would wear the Jerry Pal t-shirts. I wore it to my kids' elementary school. And this guy looks at me and says, Jerry Pal, is that like PayPal for older adults?
That's actually really smart.
How embarrassed were your kids from wearing that t-shirt, Alex?
No, they love it. They're like,
great.
Dad's famous. He's on YouTube.
How to make it in the eyes of your children.
That's right.
Louise, we always start off with song requests. You got a song request for Alex?
Okay, well, I have to admit, I've been doing a lot of public health and the whole ageism thing, so I picked REM, It's the End of the World.
Yeah.
As we know it. Just to be clear, it's not the end of the world, full stop.
Right.
Is that the song request, or are you just making a statement that it's the end of the world? It's hard to tell.
The song that's one of the two songs going through my head, and so, yeah. I'm hoping I'm not predicting the future.
I hope not, too. But, things are bad. COVID, George Floyd, and then we have unmarked officers pulling people off the street in Portland and throwing them in vans.
Don't forget murder hornets.
Yeah.
And poverty, really bad poverty and hunger.
Yeah. This is the appropriate song for the time. I will try to get through it without stumbling, which is hard with this tongue twister, but I love this song, so thank you for requesting it.
Sure.
That's great, it starts with an earthquake, birds and snakes, an airplane. Lenny Bruce is not afraid. Eye of a hurricane, listen to yourself churn. World serves its own needs, don't mess with your own needs. Speed it up a knock speed, grunt, no strength. The ladder starts to clatter with a fear of height, down height. Wire in a fire representing 7 games and a government for hire and a combat site. Left her wasn't coming in a hurry with the furies breathing down your neck. Team by team reporters baffled Trump, telegraphed, and look at that low plane, fine. Then, overflow, population, common group, but it will do. Save yourself, serve yourself. World serves its own needs, listen to your heartbeat. Tell me with the rapture and the reverend and the right. Vitriolic, patriotic, slam, fight, bright light, feeling pretty sight. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. I feel
fine. Wow, that was awesome. You did it.
First time for everything. Yep.
That was really great.
Oh, thank you. That's fun.
All right, Louise. There are so many things that I'm worried about right now, and that we're all worried about. So many things going on in 2020. Some of these things have been lasting for centuries. Do I have to add ageism as another thing that I need to worry about right now?
Eric, you're not already worried about ageism and you call yourself a geriatrician? I think you need to hang your head in shame. That is just terrible. Yes, you should worry about ageism because like we live in this crazy world where nobody wants to die and people want to stay, they want to stay alive and they want to do all these things, but it's not okay to grow old. And because it's not okay to grow old or even talk about growing old, we create a world that isn't really set up for old people. And then we blame old age for any challenges they have. It's crazy. And also, I really feel like if we start killing off one population, it's a pretty, dramatic slippery slope downward to killing off other populations or writing off other populations. You breach that ethical line and we're all in trouble.
Just read your Atlantic article not too long ago again. You start off the conversation on the Atlantic article with a hypothetical of what if this pandemic really just mainly affected the other end of the age spectrum, younger adults, school-aged children, and how would we react as a society differently? Do you think we would? And do you think ageism is playing a role there?
Definitely. Would we have the vice president saying steer clear of children? Would we have this incredible person, the commentator Bethany Mandel, who said something like, you can call me a grandma killer, I'm not sacrificing my home and food and all our doctors and every form of pleasure just to make other people comfortable. Which was sort of a broad thing about lockdown versus not, but there was an ageism, or the lieutenant governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, who said, old people should just sacrifice themselves, should children sacrifice themselves, should 40-year-olds sacrifice themselves. And, is there an argument like at least these are people who lived full lives? Yes, but again, if you start saying like certain people are of less value, then you end up with human history, which is kind of depressing, but okay, so let's try and rise above that. You end up with racism, you end up with sexism, you end up with ableism, you end up with this cycle that we have in society of saying, well, those people aren't worth as much because of the sort of work they do and the sort of lives they lead. And you don't add into that equation what opportunities we have or haven't given them. We also look at kids and we'll say, well, they're the future. Well, can't you look at older adults and say, well, they're what gave us our present? There's a way in which we have this endless double standard about old age. And I just think it's dangerous, and it allows us to take all kinds of shortcuts and get away with things, like saying the problem is theirs. And it's also really, really strange because it's the only ism really where you're having a prejudice against your future self. Like you would think self-interest alone would get rid of this, and yet it's been present throughout human history. So there's definitely something to it.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think we have that? It's the only ism that is about our future self. Like you'd imagine that we would be mindful of that.
Yeah. I think some people are better at that than others, but it's so common that I think you can't actually necessarily give people too hard a time. Like I think more we need to encourage them to see it that way. Part of it, I suspect, has to do that we all start young and everybody's more comfortable with the group they're in. And so there also is this phenomenon with ageism, which isn't so true of other isms. It's not unseen in other isms, but of internalized ageism, which is profound and ubiquitous. So usually you don't get, internalized racism or internalized sexism. I mean, you do get some of that, internalized homophobia, et cetera. Although often those things are responses to social pressors. The little black child who picks the white doll with blue eyes, because we're all taught, oh, those are the better people. The gay person who's pretending to be straight. There is this, but it's fairly uniform among older people. And I think it's because we kind of imprint on ourselves as young. I also think that was how I could write elderhood when I was in my 50s, because when I became a geriatrician, and I hear this on our, in our fellows and younger faculty members, they're talking about them. And at some point you realize oh, right. This is me too. And I really you get it intellectually, but you don't get it until it starts happening to you. And I've had so many patients over the years say, I look in the mirror and I figure who is this guy? Who is this woman? they feel like their younger self. And it's kind of like, I think it's related to that thing they say about music. Like, I know this is true for me, that I know the words to songs I didn't like when I was a teenager, and I still know the words, but I can't remember a really important article from last week in the New England Journal, right? Because certain things imprint on you when you're young. And so there's that. And then there's also the fact that life is a bit of an arc. People talk about, you go for a circle, you get to your second childhood. No, we keep moving forward, but it's shown as an arc because there's this point of increase of high power, in sort of middle adulthood, where not everybody, and actually we have more and more older people running this country for better and worse, et cetera, and running big corporations, but there is this sense of that you had something and now you're losing it. I think the extreme case of this is the people who are trying to make extreme longevity, make it so that the humans don't have to die. These are almost exclusively powerful males. And so they're at the top of the human hierarchy and they can't bear the thought of falling down at all. And that is more of a universal experience that we have as we get older, where old age, instead of being seen as elderhood, I mean, that was part of why I called the book Elderhood, is seen as an inferior adulthood instead of as a progression through into the third major stage of life. So it happens commonly and naturally, and that doesn't mean we can't do something about it.
I'd like to hear more about how you see ageism playing out in your everyday clinical practice. And this is something that you wrote about in New England Journal. I wonder if you could share with us any stories you have from your clinic experiences as a geriatrician, caring for patients in this era of COVID.
Oh, well, you see it in all sorts of different ways. I mean, I think a way I see it commonly is somebody has gotten sick, whether they're at home or in the hospital, and they've gotten a little bit deconditioned. And so often we'll start them on some physical therapy, some rehab. And there are exceptions to this, but often what I see is that they're not pushed enough, either not by themselves, not by their families, not by the physical therapist, not by their primary doctor, that everybody assumes like you're old and now you were sick and so now you're going to be worse off. And there's not much you can do about it. Whereas we actually know you can build muscle and you can regain function and all these things, but it takes a little longer. Like things are definitely slower as we get older. So can we do things? Yes, we can, but not if you don't try. And I'll write on my prescription, like, I want you to do resistance training with this person. And sometimes it still doesn't happen. Like they won't give them the weights, and you have to build the muscle to get the functional capacity. We also see, and we're seeing a lot of this with COVID, where early on, the geriatrics community knew absolutely that people were presenting with confusion, that they were presenting with falls, that they were presenting by fainting, more likely in frailer and older adults. And there was actually interesting data from Italy, so that it was corroborated in at least one other country. There was abundant data that this was happening. But the CDC didn't include confusion until May in their list. We pushed hard at UCSF to get it included at least, but then they would include on the outpatient side, not on the inpatient side. And then I'm part of our San Francisco Department of Public Health response, and we just heard about a facility where a woman in her 90s stopped eating, which is another common presentation, and they let her not eat for 3 days, and then they found her unresponsive and sent her to the hospital. So we keep seeing this, and it remains not on people's lists. So it's what we expect of people, not acknowledging they present differently, that needs are different, and that progress is possible. Like if you assume something's impossible and you don't work for it, it's not going to happen. And then you say, oh yeah, old age sucks. But you've created that reality.
Mm-hmm. Just as the COVID epidemic has exposed underlying systemic racism, structural racism. We had a podcast about this as well. We can link to in our show notes. You've pointed out
that one. Actually, it was great.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And you really pointed out that it's exposed systemic ageism in our system. And I wonder if you could comment on ways in which you've seen this ageism operate on a health system, national policy level, allocation of resources, et cetera, during COVID?
So many ways. One way is clearly the symptom list, because if you're not looking for symptoms, you're not going to find them and recognize it as COVID. And actually, the New York data suggests that part of the reason older adults didn't do so well was that they went in saying, I'm sick. They weren't tested for COVID because they didn't have any of the COVID symptoms. They were sent back home. And then they came back in really sick, were admitted and tested positive because those symptoms weren't being recognized. But there are all kinds of other things. One of the metrics of whether you're in surge or not has to do with whether health workers have sufficient PPE. So in most of these metrics, it doesn't include people who work in nursing homes or other elder care facilities, even though those have been the places where most people have died.
Right.
Disproportional numbers of people. So we're not, and that's actually kind of a twofer, or maybe a threefer societally, right? Because you're not protecting the old people. You're not protecting the workers, who are the poor people and often the people from the communities of color who are also disproportionately getting sick. Instead, you're giving it to the advantaged physicians at the advantaged hospitals. So then we say, oh, it's this nursing home travesty. And yes, are there things about nursing home policy and the way nursing homes are run that are contributing to this without question? But it is also our national policies and our health system and public health systems' failure to acknowledge that these people matter and deserve PPE. On an even bigger scale, I don't know if you guys saw, Sid Mukherjee had an article, early June or early May in the New Yorker. And he talked about how in Japan they'd had a crisis and they repurposed factories to make equipment that it was a car factory. I'm not going to get this right. And they repurposed other factories so that they could avert this national crisis and meet a need in a key manufacturing sector. So we could, as a nation, have way more N95s. I spent part of this morning looking up, K95 versus N95, are they as good? They say, okay, we've got to use it because that's all we have, but we can't, CDC says we can't follow the manufacturing chain. We could, as a country, be making 5-6 months, we could have been making N95s. All these old people who are locked up and depressed and losing conditioning, losing mental function, if they had a fitted N95, they could go out, they could live, and then they wouldn't be such a burden on the health system. We've created that burden.
Yeah, I'm thinking back. There's so much focus on things like ventilators early on.
It's classic.
That it really hasn't panned out, but a simple N95 mask, why are this far into it, why are we still having shortages? Why are we still talking about this, even in a healthcare institution, let alone giving it to the most vulnerable population so they can actually avert some of the risks we had? It's shocking.
Yeah, no, we literally can't get it. I'm doing at a site visit at a facility that's had several cases. How do I find one? And then the K95, maybe it doesn't need to be fit tested. So if it doesn't need to be fit tested, does that mean the air can, just are you kidding me? You really, and people say these things and it literally does not occur to them that this is systematic structural ageism.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, as you're talking about going to facility, you work for the Department of Public Health in San Francisco. I wanted to ask you more about that by way of, signaling to our listeners that there are things they can do about this as well. And our listeners, as you know, are primarily clinicians, some researchers, but overwhelmingly clinicians, geriatricians, geriatric nurse practitioners, palliative care docs, palliative care nurses, social workers, chaplains. What are you doing locally, and what can our listeners do locally to combat ageism in the era of COVID?
Well, if you can be part of any COVID-related effort, you should be. At the beginning, they were calling for people to help in the hospital in ICUs. So, I last worked in that setting in the 1990s in any serious way. So I'm kind of thinking like you would be getting not good care if you received it from me. So I was thinking, well, what else can I do? Because there's so many ways you can help and use what you know. So obviously I was writing the articles and I was volunteering at UCSF, but then we didn't surge. They didn't really need me. So then I looked at the Department of Public Health. And for me, it was that people I had trained with, one guy who was ahead of me as our health officer, and the guy who's in charge of health services for the city was a year behind me. So I just wrote them a note and said, look, can I do anything? And then it turned out that the Department of Public Health was really happy to have geriatricians. They hadn't come to us, but they actually were even willing to pay us. So a group of us have been working there and they need us, right? So they have a lot of people who have a lot of expertise in infectious disease and they don't know anything about old people or old bodies or what matters in older lives or even the facilities we're going into. Like they'll make these comments and then some of them will go out on these site visits. They'll be like, oh my God, like I had no idea. How do you do this? And what does this mean? And they don't know. And these are, I want to be completely clear. These are incredibly hardworking, dedicated people who are killing themselves to help with this pandemic. None of this is intentional. If I had to go deal with babies now, what would I do? Or, I did peds in 1990. So we just have to acknowledge that really good people can do harm because they don't know what they don't know. And the more we're in the room, and sometimes also they'll want to put out these policies or guidances. There are just so many problems with them. And yes, negotiating that takes weeks and sometimes months, and it's hard work and it can be frustrating. But none of that would be happening if the group of us from CSF weren't at the table. So I think anybody can volunteer in ways large and small. We have some people doing a few hours a week and other people doing most of their job now.
We've had past discussions about rationing of resources. Certainly, we've touched upon it here with PPE supplies. We've had Doug White talk about rationing of medications to treat COVID. I'm wondering kind of from your perspective, kind of how you're thinking about ageism and our response to limited resources with this pandemic.
I think this is part of my larger response to this. Like, well, yeah, if you let someone get critically ill, it's super expensive. But guess what? Prevention is way cheaper. And also the people are happier because people would actually rather not get sick in the first place than get really sick and get excellent care. And yet the entire financial structure of the American healthcare system is about, cutting edge science and treatments for this rare disease and this kind of intensive. If you look at the buildings, and it's not just our institution, like I also should be clear about that. I travel all over the country and everybody's got their precision medicine and their genomics and their heart center and their cancer center and their this and their that. And does anybody say, oh my gosh, let me show you our primary care center. Let me show you our, where we teach people really how to exercise and figure out something that they will do in perpetuity. Let us show you, our test kitchen. Let us show you how we're really working with the community, not just putting up a poster on the side of a bus. Like we have plenty of money in our health system. The problem is where we put it.
Yeah, I guess the other question, the follow-up question to that too is, and I've read a couple of your articles, and there's also a focus on kind of advanced care planning. Focusing on vulnerable populations and having these discussions. I guess the question is, how much focus should we have on that, or is this perpetuating this ageist issue of, oh, you're going to get sick, so we better have this discussion because, you're a vulnerable population and you're going to die from this?
Yeah, I totally agree. We just had this whole hullabaloo at SF Department of Public Health about what's your risk for COVID flyer that was all about like old people, be careful going to see old people are at high risk. And, all of us at the Senior Hub were like, oh no, don't do it. Yes, it's true. And everybody needs to wear a mask. Mm-hmm. And again, that was well-meaning and not untrue. And the problem is we really have trouble as individuals and as a society with complexity, right? So it can be true that it probably does make more sense to do advanced care planning if you're over 80 in the age of COVID. And we shouldn't write you off entirely. I mean, there have been some pretty good studies. There's that European collaborative, the article in The Lancet about frailty. And it was very clear that it had much more to do with frailty than with age. And a lot of older people are pushing back on this. There was an article in the Washington Post recently about somebody who was 62 talking to other people in their early 60s. And they're like, hey, we just found out we're old. But is our risk the same as the risk as the person who's bedbound in a nursing home and 98 and has advanced dementia? They're thinking not, and I'm thinking they're right. So there's a way in which we don't really discuss the gradations. And maybe, is it that it should be universal, or that it should be universal for anybody in any of the higher risk groups? At the same time, I have a lot of patients, and I know a lot of people who are, some of them over 75, certainly anybody over 85, who says, look, if I need a ventilator, forget it. Not everybody, but really almost everybody I've spoken to, because that's not going to go well for me. Do I want everything up until then? Yes. But if we don't ask those questions, I mean, this is, again, our crazy health system, right? So you could have, a frail, 80-something or 90-something-year-old with multiple other conditions on a ventilator for weeks, costing probably millions of dollars, certainly hundreds of thousands, for care that he or she doesn't want and will never recover from. But we can't get people the PPE they need, or do the advanced care planning, acknowledging that, I was on a program where somebody was talking about, putting books at every pediatrician's office, and handing people books. We do things for different age groups. Maybe this is what we need to do. And we also just have to get people used to death and using the word death. Because if you're in your 80s or 90s, what's going to happen in the relatively near future. It happens to all of us. But I'm constantly also hearing clinicians saying, well, they passed on, or they passed away, or if we can't use the word death, no one is ever going to get comfortable with death.
Back to the hospital for a moment. I'm interested to hear your perspective on visitor policy for older adults. Most hospitals still have restrictions in place around visitors. And this is potentially detrimental when, patient has dementia or is at risk for delirium, and their loved one and caregiver who they know, their familiar face, is not allowed in. And then you can see the other side of it too. We don't want to put that person at risk. It exposes the other patients in the hospital and healthcare workers to an additional person from outside. Interested in where you come down on this issue.
Well, I think there's sort of two main issues here. One is the difference between a friendly visitor and an essential caregiver. An essential caregiver is a person whose presence either pragmatically provides care for you or keeps you from declining in your physical health. So we're also seeing this across nursing homes and residential care facilities. And Nathan Stahl and Samir Sinha in Canada have just published something last week that was great on this distinction. And I can send you the link after if you don't have it. But I think that's a really important distinction. We think of caregivers as only being paid, but the fact is, particularly in elder care, most caregivers are not paid. And if somebody's going downhill, absent their family or friend caregiver, that is an essential worker, and so should be allowed in. So that's one part of the perspective. And somebody's we also have to acknowledge that when a person gets sick, a person who previously was their spouse or their child might become an essential caregiver in the setting of delirium, for example, even if the person didn't require care prior to becoming delirious or hospitalized. The second thing is that most of the places that have not allowed family support for older patients have allowed family support for children. So either we are allowing in supports to people who need them or we are not. That is overt structural, ageism. So you say this is a vulnerable population. It's kind of like, and we do this at all levels of society, but right, you abandon your kid, you go to prison, you get in trouble. You abandon your elderly parent, nothing, no biggie, right? So we just need to impose these standards consistently.
Talking about like imposing standards, I was just thinking like, we've done podcasts on like the disparities in care with COVID, and certainly reading every major medical journal right now, it is a topic on healthcare providers' minds, and there is rightfully a outroar over this. With that said, like we've all played our role in making healthcare look like healthcare does. You don't see that outpouring of emotions around, you mentioned in your article, like 80% of all deaths are in older adults. So there is this huge difference in who is getting the disease and who's dying from it. And like, you're not seeing these publications coming out around ageism. And honestly, like when you see these numbers, I think for most people thank God it's not happening to younger adults. We've talked about messaging around structural racism, how to actually approach some of these issues when we see them. Is there messaging around this? Are there ways that we can respond as clinicians when we are pretty much shown like right up front that there is ageism going on here?
Yeah, I think an important thing is it shouldn't be a competition. And of course, you can be Black and old simultaneously. And that's actually not so good for you, right? Because often these things are synergistic more than additive. And you could be Black and female and old. It just goes on and on and on. So I think that one matters doesn't mean another doesn't matter. Are there some differences? Yes. Some of the people who are now being discriminated against had very privileged lives previously, whereas if you are a Black in the United States, even before you're born, we're doing harm to you as a system, when you look at the birth outcomes and things like that. So that is a little different. At the same time, again, sort of it doesn't mean that ageism doesn't also exist and matter. And I actually think a system that starts looking at its isms as a whole, we basically have this health system, that was created by, privileged men of a certain age and race in their own image. And it has been changing a little bit, but not enough. If you also look at the history of medicine, what you'll see is we started admitting more women to medical school classes in the 80s, and women's health really came to the fore in the 90s. We started adding more people of color to medical school classes in this century, and now we've got white coats for Black lives and people standing up for that. And throughout society, it's sort of, there's a point where people get a voice. In medicine, it's hard for older people because you'd have to be an absolute lunatic to go to medical school at 80. Like, I can't even imagine doing it. Forget it, right? So they're never going to be part of that decision. But on a societal level, I also think we have such a sense of like, you've had your time, don't speak up for yourself, that people feel like they can't make noise. And maybe it'll call attention to how old they are, and that's like the worst thing about them. So it's changing a bit. I think the silent and great generations really didn't stand up for themselves. You'd have people in excruciating pain who wouldn't admit it. Boomers are doing better, and I do think that's why we're starting to see more of this. And in fairness to Gen Z, maybe in particular, and a variety of others. But there was a lot of comment, at least initially, on the nursing home crisis and all the deaths in nursing homes. And we've never seen so much press about aging. But has it followed through to its logical conclusion? And has it gone beyond just sympathy to actually looking at the structures that cause these problems? But we also have, tons of young people volunteering and making a difference. I do think if the older people who aren't already vulnerable would stand up for themselves and say they're old, if you had, like RBG does it, but, do we hear Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden or Donald Trump or, whichever side you're on, Mitch McConnell? There's so many of them, right? Those are old people. Those are old people in power, and they don't lobby. You have the Black Caucus, you have the women's groups in Congress. You don't have like the old age group because nobody wants to be part of it. So now I can't even remember your question. I really apologize.
Louise, you've been leading the charge in so many public outlets and medical journals around this issue of ageism. I wonder who else you see as being a leader and thinking ahead and thinking clearly about this issue, and who you're reading and listening to about this topic.
Oh, there are so many good people. There's Ashton Applewhite, who wrote This Chair Rocks, and has a TED Talk that's been powerful. And some people in the geriatrics community sort of fault her for being on the side of the fitter, younger old. And I actually think there was some of that early on, and now she's really looking at the intersection of ageism and ableism, and thinking more broadly. So I think she's someone to look out for. There are, I mentioned Nathan Stahl and the group in Canada are doing things. Mike Wasserman has been very vocal about the nursing home crisis. And he and I have discussed that, some of his techniques would not be something I would do, and yet they worked. He was all over the news. I think there are so many different ways we can speak out for this, and you have to call it, but you can call it in a really polite way. I mean, I seriously believe, certainly in our medical circles, that people are not, even in the public health effort, there've been all these things where we're just like, those of us in the senior hub were like, oh God, it can't be true. And yet everyone who worked on that worked hard and meant well. So I think if you start understanding that people aren't out to get old. I mean, yes, there's some people out to get old people, but most of the people like we get to interact with are not in that boat. And so you need to explain. There's a lot of time. I mean, I can't tell you how much time I spend crafting these emails. I mean, it's a stupid email, right? But you have to say it in a way that people can hear it. And I also find comparing it to things that they're used to looking at and showing how it's a perfect analogy is really helpful.
My last question for you. You have a magic wand. You can make 2 to 3 changes right now with that wand. You have a couple things that you'd have. Let's focus on the healthcare system or healthcare providers, things that they should be doing differently.
I was going to say I would have to do global poverty if we were going big, but there are all these people starving to death. That's really not good. So healthcare system.
Yeah, and specifically around ageism.
Around ageism, I would, this is big, but you did say I had a magic wand. So I would restructure medical education and clinical services and research dollars proportional to use of health services. So that there would just be structures and money and time devoted to aging, like all the time, because who uses health services the most? So I'd probably do that. I think, overhauling time and buildings and money in particular.
Wonderful. Anything else you'd like to add, Louise, before we get a little bit more of REM?
At the end of the world, I guess... I'll reference the song. So it's the end of the world as we know it. So there are some things we're all missing, like hugs and, certain friends and traveling, etc. And so if the world is ending in that regard, it's not so good. But I don't think the world is ending completely. And the ending of the world as we know it might also mean the end to structural racism, the end to old people being cut out of health system, the end to nursing homes that aren't like homes but are more like prisons. So think of this not as, in the song they talk about all sorts of things that are wrong also. But every time we're seeing things that are wrong, it's an opportunity to do it differently. And one of the most fascinating things about COVID was how quickly health institutions pivoted and changed all their priorities, services, and funds flow. So we used to say it couldn't be done. We watched them do it in a matter of weeks. So if they don't do it to make for a better healthcare system so that we actually have a healthy populace, that is a decision they are making, largely for their own profits and comfort, rather than for the health of the populace. We know they can do it. They should do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are making me hopeful right now. I got to say, I don't feel hopeful. Especially, I feel like things are going in the wrong direction with institutional care, with the pandemic. We are further and further isolating them into institutional care where like nobody's visiting, nobody's allowed to visit. I think most hospitals, their visitors are not something that they're concerned about. And I'm usually an optimist, but man, I feel like things are actually potentially getting worse in that regard.
Well, I keep saying in San Francisco that so far we have killed more people with our COVID policy than have died from the virus among older adults. And that doesn't even include the harms done, the harms we can't even calculate because we can't get to many of these people. But again, working within, we have a visitor policy. It was all ready to go. It was actually approved on one day, and then the surge started and it was revoked the next day. We have activities approvals that are about ready to roll out. We can all make a difference on these things, but we also have to explain how important this is. And people who are in charge of this are generally seeing everything just through an infectious disease lens or an internal medicine lens. And this is where the geriatrics and palliative care lenses that are truly person-centered absolutely need to be invoked and imposed and tell people, etc. And I think they're thinking we need to make residential care facilities like nursing homes, and we need to make nursing homes even more like isolation units in maximum security prisons. Don't let that happen. Like we all need to speak up. And the other thing I've started doing is when older people send me notes, I send them a list of all the different people they can contact at the local and state level, and media outlets they can go to make a difference. Everybody should be speaking up.
That's great. On that note, these lyrics are prophetic in some ways. A tournament of lies. How does that sound like? Offer me solutions, offer me alternatives, and I decline. If we only had face masks, 4 or 5 months ago. And then some are just ridiculous. Birthday party, cheesecake, jelly bean, boom, you symbiotic, patriotic, slam butt neck, right? Right. I love these lyrics. All right, here we go, a little bit more. 6 o'clock TV hour, don't get caught in foreign tower, slash and burn, return, listen to yourself turn, lock him in uniform, book burning, blood betting, every motive escalate, automotive incinerate, light a candle, light a motive, step down, watch your heel crush, uh-oh, this means don't fear, cavalier, renegade, and steering clear, tournament of lies, offer me solutions, offer me alternatives, and I decline, as the end of the world as we know it, it's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. And I feel fine.
Well, Louise, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you
it's
so much,
always a
Louise.
pleasure. We're going to have to, that Jerry Pal face mask will be sent your way soon.
I'm so excited. Swag from the podcast. Yeah.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for joining us, and Archstone Foundation for your continued support.
Thanks, everybody. Until next time. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks.